Well, thank you very much for a great panel. Now it is my great privilege to introduce to you the last concluding session for our first half day here. So our concluding fireside chat will occur with Ann Neuberger. General Nakasone last month named her the new Director of Cybersecurity at the NSA, directly reporting to General Nakasone, and he launched a new Cybersecurity Directorate, which she will lead. On October 1st, the new Cybersecurity Directorate will become operational. So this is a very timely fireside chat that will be delivered and run by Nilu Razi Howe, known to most of you, a longtime cybersecurity investor and executive. So if those of you who are on the sides could come in, we look forward to a great fireside chat, and we will now begin. So I'll turn it over to Nilu.
Tom, thank you so much. And this is a thrill to be having this conversation with you. And it's a pretty important moment for the agency with the announcement of the new Cybersecurity Directorate. But before we get to that, I want to talk about you for a second. You've been at the agency for a while now and have held some really interesting roles, from being in the Operations Directorate, being the first Chief Risk Officer, working in the Commercial Solutions Center, all of which sets you up to be the perfect choice to run the Cybersecurity Directorate. What's even more interesting and unusual is that you didn't start your career at the NSA. And it's an agency that's known for having a lot of people who spent their life there. You came in as an outsider from the financial services sector. I'd love to understand first what led you to make that decision, and maybe what were the lessons learned from the private sector that you brought to your work at the agency.
Great. Thank you so much, Nilu. It's a pleasure to be here and certainly to have a conversation with you as we launch the Cybersecurity Directorate. I was raised in New York, and my father came to America as a refugee after the Hungarian Revolution. My grandparents came as refugees, and they raised us to feel a tremendous sense of gratitude, to have the opportunity to be Americans, to have the opportunity to... My father would often talk about just the freedom of opportunity, the ability to pursue whatever one wished, and to try to make the most of oneself in a country that didn't have a historic sense of class or where one belonged. So just to feel that that was a debt that one had to repay. As a New Yorker, I lived in New York through 9/11, and in 2007, I just had this sense, driving home from work one day, that the US government was struggling with our war in Iraq. There were civilians dying, service members dying, and I heard my father's voice saying, sometimes for freedom, it's time to give up oneself, to give up one's time. So I recalled I'd had a professor tell me about a program called the White House Fellows Program. I quickly called him before I could change my mind, and I came into government as a White House Fellow. I worked for Secretary Gates as the Secretary of Defense for a year, and then later, after a stint in the Navy, moved over to NSA. So you asked a question about how those private sector experiences shaped the way, at least in this role, I'm seeking to approach cybersecurity. And there are a few different ways. First, I started my career as a computer programmer, built some of the company's first efforts to allow people to buy stock shares online. And I recall the pressure to get code out versus get secure code out. And that's certainly something, how we drive towards more secure code, that continues to be something as an industry, as a cybersecurity industry, we need to address today. The second factor certainly is, within financial services, we were something called a back office. It sounds really boring, really uninteresting, but that back office is what drives hundreds of millions, billions of transactions every single day. And there's a cross-sector set of vulnerabilities that no one company can address alone. So seeing that, understanding that the weakest link across the sector could bring systemic risk to the entire financial sector was something I lived working in a back office. Certainly the financial sector has made a lot of progress in the last 12 years since I left the private sector, but that's something that we bring to the way we approach risk. I think then finally, as I mentioned, I was a computer programmer, and at the time, the SEC had a rule that companies had to retain stock certificates for 7 years.
Yep.
And we had floors and floors of stock certificates to retain for transactions. And at the time, we wanted to scan those and make them available quickly anytime somebody called into a call center with a question. So we were making the case that retention could mean retaining a virtual copy, not a physical copy. The challenge was scanning and OCRing certificates when they're embossed would throw off the machines. So we had to do all kinds of interesting things, coding with ancient 16-bit code, daisy chaining serial printers to generate barcodes. Bottom line, policy has to keep up with advances in technology for us to make the most of technology. And that's certainly something that we see in the cybersecurity industry today, and we certainly see in the intelligence community as well.
Well, that's a fantastic segue to talking about the Cybersecurity Directorate, because there's no question that we really have to reimagine cybersecurity, and it's just phenomenal to see the agency taking a lead by setting up this directorate. What led to this? It happened within the first year of General Nakasone becoming the director of the NSA and the head of Cyber Command. What was the story behind this? And is this simply a reorganization, or is there a strategy behind it?
So after a year, General Nakasone, the director of NSA, talked about a sense that the national security landscape of the country had changed, where our adversaries could achieve strategic impact by tactical actions. So attempting to use influence operations to shake confidence in a democracy, stealing intellectual property to gain potential military parity with the United States as the most advanced military in the world. And he had a sense that as those trends in the cybersecurity industry, in the cybersecurity area also changed, more sophisticated capabilities, easier to use sophisticated capabilities, that NSA really had to up its game. And that's what drove this desire to stand up a directorate and frankly to set a pretty aggressive mission, which is to prevent and eradicate cyber actors from national security systems and critical infrastructure with a focus on the defense industrial base.
Now that is, and I just want to pause on that for a second, because that is an incredible articulation of the mission of the Cybersecurity Directorate, to prevent and eradicate threats. It's, I think, appropriately aggressive. Can we get there?
We must. The nation needs it of us. We see the threats that we face. We see the sophistication and the scope and scale. And we believe, and clearly when we say we, that's NSA and all of our partners, because everything we do in partnership with other agencies, with allies around the world, and certainly the private sector plays a role. But the threat demands it, and the nation deserves that we achieve it.
So as you work to achieve that mission statement, the initial stand-up date is October 1st for the cybersecurity. And by the way, as someone who comes from the private sector, you know, anytime someone says the government doesn't work fast enough, I hope people appreciate how incredibly fast a new directorate is being created within the intelligence community. It's months from announcement to initial operating capability. So October 1st is the stand-up date. What are the priorities of the new directorate as you head toward the October 1 date?
So first, I'll take a moment to publicly thank my team for that really rapid stand-up. You are correct, thank you. And many people across the agency are pulling hard.
Are you getting sleep?
to get that done. So what are our priorities? 3 things. I would characterize them as unify, focus on the hardest cybersecurity problems, and enhance collaboration. What do I mean by unify? We want to deepen the collaboration between our threat analysis community, our vulnerability assessment community, and our mitigations community. And most importantly, the people in those communities. So the people who really understand threat, various adversaries, the techniques that they use, the infrastructure that they use, the personas that are most effective. And combine that with people who do defense, who understand vulnerabilities, the scale. In a given stack, what are the most significant vulnerabilities? Bring those communities together, deepen that, and focus them on cybersecurity outcomes. I'll give an example. NSA generates hundreds of threat intelligence reports on cybersecurity. In those, we detail adversaries' capabilities, threats. We also have a defensive mission that builds cryptographic algorithms, cryptographic solutions, and provides security advice for the nation's most sensitive systems. They work together. We want to deepen that and generate one product, ideally unclassified and quickly, to make it really usable. And then, as I noted, the final priority is enhancing collaboration, deepening it, doing it in the unclassified space to truly bring together all the elements that are needed to quickly identify a threat and quickly address it.
So I want to pull on that thread that you just hit on, which is one of the unique attributes of the NSA is that it both has a signals intelligence mission and a cybersecurity mission. And that can be a virtue if one informs the other, and it's certainly been aspirational. It sounds like the goal here is to not just make it aspirational, but operationalize it and get to a place where offense is informing defense. Is that right?
It is. There's also a shift. We've heard a lot of feedback that some of the information we would share, for example, IP address, domain names, are temporary. And by the time they're shared, they're no longer useful. So it's a shift to say, yes, and when we share threat information at the unclassified level, it needs to be more context. What are the overall goals of the actor? How do they pull together those goals using an exploit, using particular infrastructure to launch against a particular set of targets? So we want to change from those more tactical elements being shared to pictures that help cybersecurity individuals who work the mission each day use that information for better impact.
So what are the biggest threats that we're facing in cyberspace, and are we actually set up to face them, prevent, and eradicate them?
So first, clearly, ransomware is a focus. We've seen there are roughly 4,000 ransomware attacks a day. But in the intelligence community, we put a tremendous focus on countries, what their plans are, and how they use cyber to achieve their strategic objectives. And each one does things a bit different because their strategic objectives are a bit different. So when we look at Russia, we see a country that uses influence operations, uses cyber really integrated and below the level of armed conflict. They also use entities who aren't necessarily easily tied to the government, whether the Internet Research Agency for potential elections influence, or mercenaries to fight military conflicts in Ukraine or Syria, for example. So certainly a very sophisticated actor, and always thinking creatively about how cyber helps achieve its broader objectives. When we look at China, I think they're perhaps best characterized with 3 examples of the kinds of operations, strategic, capable, scope, and scale of how they use cyber to achieve their national security objectives and military. 3 examples: the OPM attack, the Cloud Hopper set of activities, and IP theft. So OPM, essentially stealing information about every American who holds a clearance. One can think pretty easily about how that information could be useful to a country seeking to identify potential spies. Certainly, secondly, Cloud Hopper, a set of activities targeting managed security providers, managed service providers. Of course, that's of interest because by accessing one can gain credentials and move across those trusted connections between different targets. And then finally, IP theft. China has done IP theft. The Subin case, a recent FBI indictment, is a great example where they had a businessman essentially directing military hackers towards specific aircraft technology that would be useful to China to to accelerate their military development. I'll quickly sum up 2 other major actors. Clearly Iran, very volatile, has used destructive attacks in its region primarily. And North Korea, who always fascinates us as essentially nation-state criminals, as a country under sanctions, using creative ways of cyber, whether it's cryptocurrency, whether it's crypto mining to gain hard currency, and essentially keep the regime afloat.
So as we gain information about the various adversaries out there, do we have the mechanism in place to communicate this information to the folks who own the classified networks, who control the defense industrial base, the national security systems, and ultimately critical infrastructure?
You know, it's interesting. I think the mechanism is often the easy part. Yes, they exist. I bet that any number of people in this room have been involved in an effort to create a mechanism over the last number of years. What's more challenging is creating the urgency, the operationalization of intelligence to rapidly share while something is relevant. Ideally, we are sharing the threat information to prevent an attack, to prevent exploitation, rather than being part of a team that helps with incident response. So bottom line, it's recognizing the power we have to prevent an attack through rapid sharing, and ideally at the unclassified level so it can be easily used to defend a network.
So a great example of this might be the Russia Small Group. That was a special task force that was created to protect the 2018 midterm elections, and you led that task force. What were the lessons that were learned from the Russia small group, and how do you apply them more broadly as you set up the Cybersecurity Directorate?
Absolutely. So first, I co-led that with Major General Tim Hawk of U.S. Cyber Command. It was a really good example of bringing both organizations together, each bringing their unique capability for a better effect. And firstly, it was stood up out of a realization that something had dramatically changed, and we had to reboot our approach as a U.S. government. You know, influence operations have been around since the days of Adam and Eve, but what had really changed was the age of social media, where a country seeking to influence could do direct, focused, but also broad messaging, very specific to particular ethnic groups, to particular geographic elements of a country, in a pretty cheap way. And second, cryptocurrency, which essentially allow also doing it anonymously, looking as if one is an American if you're aiming to influence Americans. So we realized that that took a more creative approach to address, to protect our democracy. So in the Russia small group, as you noted, we work closely to ensure, to really work with DHS and FBI to ensure that DHS, from a cyber perspective, had all the threat information we had in a way that could be quickly actionable. FBI, from an influence perspective, had information about how social media was being used, how individuals were seeking to be anonymous or appear to be Americans, so that could be rapidly shared with social media providers and hopefully those accounts shut down under their own terms of use. And at the end of the day, we recognize that it's an alliance of democracies, so we also work to share our lessons with other countries and ask them that when they had their own elections, they should please come back, share what they had learned with us, so we could together ensure that we were defending our populations and our democratic processes to the best that we could.
How successful were we with Russia small group and with protecting the election?
We're tremendously proud of the work we did between NSA Cyber Command, DHS, and FBI to defend the integrity of our elections and ensure that every American know that their vote counted and their vote mattered.
So how do we take this forward to 2020, and what are the biggest threats that we should be concerned about with respect to the 2020 election?
So we're taking the same three-part approach: ensure there's threat intelligence, gain those insights, share that intelligence, and be prepared to impose costs on an adversary who may attempt to influence our elections. And I'm sure you saw the DHS Director of CISA, Chris Krebs, stated elections as one of his key priorities as well.
So you mentioned ransomware earlier. How concerned should we be about ransomware with respect to the 2020 elections?
Ransomware is really interesting. 4,000 attacks a day over the last number of years. And according to Malwarebytes, I think they've talked about how they've seen a shift from targeting individuals to targeting entities. So that's certainly something that would make it be a key concern for the elections. The best protection is the same security advice we give. Ensure one uses principles of least privilege. Computers with admin access shouldn't have access to the internet. Patch at all times, and mostly make state, and elections are really managed by state and locals, teach them, make them aware of the dangers of that. Many ransomware attacks start with a spearfish email and clicking on the wrong thing, and that they have a critical role in this larger process.
When we talk about election security, what we're really talking about is protecting the root of trust, which our democracy is based on. It's foundational to us. So whether it's election interference, weaponization of social media, fake news, deep fakes, et cetera, it seems that a foundational principle for any cybersecurity directorate would be to help protect that root of trust. Does NSA play a role in protecting the root of trust for our democracy?
So this is something I'm particularly passionate about because of my family history. My dad grew up under communism, and I often see that until today, that trust in government is shaped by growing up as a child in a country where the average citizen does not have trust in government. And at its root, it's a question of, Bruce Schneier talks about democracy's dilemma, which is that what makes us a democracy, the ability for individuals to communicate, to talk, to try to influence each other, change their opinion, debate big issues, is also in many cases the root of our weakness, in that people can be influenced and their opinions change with false information. So the best defense is each of us as Americans understanding that there are malicious entities who seek to influence us online, who seek to appear to be Americans and influence online, and really learn to question what we see online, the role of anonymous accounts and how we communicate with those. But yes, we will do the same work we did in 2018, looking to see who are actors seeking to shake confidence in the integrity of our elections, the root of our trust, and share that with the FBI so that they could work closely with social media companies and other providers to shut down that activity.
We often talk about having a whole of government response, but what you're really talking about is a whole of society response to what's going on, because it goes beyond what just the government can do. It's about individuals, it's about academia, it's about our schools, it's about education broadly.
Absolutely.
So let's shift for a second to the defense industrial base, a place where NSA has very clear authority to protect. 20 or 30 years ago, it was pretty clear what constituted the defense industrial base, but as we move to off-the-shelf software, as we move to cloud providers and operating systems that are commercially available, it seems to me that how we think about the defense industrial base has shifted. How should we think about it today, and how will NSA engage with this increasingly broad set of organizations to protect the DIB?
It certainly has shifted, and we start with what are nation states' goals with the defense industrial base, and we really see three things. First, there's a great deal of risk because it allows countries who seek specific technologies to gain those technologies and put the United States investments in R&D at risk by gaining parity. Similarly, from a military capabilities perspective, it allows foreign countries to jumpstart their advancements by essentially leveraging the United States investments in research and technology. And we see that as well across our economic sector, where stealing intellectual property and gaining to market faster can put our future economic strength at risk. So essentially, we look at it in two parts. One, we can't expect every defense industrial base company to fully defend itself against a nation-state actor who will put investment and effort, time and people to gain what it seeks. But neither can the government be completely responsible to do that work. So there's a balance between the two, and we're looking for certainly creative approaches to share threat intelligence, but also ways to allow smaller companies to quickly jump their cyber capabilities.
One of the things that we used to 100% rely on the NSA for was really setting the building codes and standards for what good software, what secure software, what secure hardware looked like. NSA seems to have retreated a little bit from that role. With the stand-up of this new Cybersecurity Directorate, will NSA take that back over and really set the standard again, the building codes and standards for good hardware and software, and is that a way to address this issue of security within the DIB?
You know, absolutely. We talked earlier about the mission statement of the Cybersecurity Directorate, and the first word, as you recall, is prevent. Because at the end of the day, if we build strong, if we bake security in, we make our cybersecurity risk far less. NSA has a mission that's not well known, which is essentially our mission in support of national security systems. So we build the keys and codes. We build roughly 1 million keys and codes each year that are the root of trust for secure communications, secure command and control for the armed forces, various government agencies, and allies around the world. And in that mission, we build cryptographic standards, we build the cryptography. We must play a role with other agencies like NIST in areas where we have unique expertise and operational experience, sharing that to achieve broader effect, because it's in all of our interest to have products built strong.
And just to pull on that thread for a second, as we look at next generation of technologies, I mean, 5G is one piece of it, but quantum and thinking about post-quantum, how involved will this directorate be from an innovation standpoint, really thinking ahead of the curve in terms of the technology trends that are happening and how we can make sure we don't fall behind?
Absolutely. Quantum is a great example where the potential development of a quantum computer puts a particular kind of cryptography at risk, which is the root of much of internet commerce. So we are already playing a role in working to build quantum-resistant cryptography. We certainly will be deploying that across, as I noted, the mission we talked about, where we deploy 1 million keys plus another set for nuclear command and control. It's clearly an area of interest and an area where we believe it fits the category I mentioned earlier, operational expertise, unique technical expertise, and clearly of interest to national security systems and the defense industrial base and armed services.
So as we think about those issues, the question of partnerships comes to mind. And you had mentioned the importance of the partners for the new Cybersecurity Directorate. But what is the expansive set of partners that will become critical for success, including private sector partners, whether they're technology companies, service providers, whatever they may be? How important are the partnerships? And what role will NSA play with these public-private partnerships?
Partners are key. They are the root of everything we can accomplish. When I talked earlier, you asked me, is prevent and eradicate possible? And I said, we owe it to the nation. That was across our partnerships. Across government, clearly, within DoD, the CIO, the acquisition community, Cyber Command. Across government, working in partnership with DHS, supporting their mission of supporting critical infrastructure. Our allies around the world, NSA's long participated in something called common criteria, where we set a standard, and as countries, we agree that we'll accept that standard in products. It makes it easier for the private sector to build to a certain security standard and then sell to multiple countries. And then clearly the private sector. There's unique insights, in some cases specialized insights, like control systems. And the private sector is often the first indicator of a significant threat or a significant compromise. So clearly working closely with the private sector in an unclassified mission is a big focus that we seek to achieve.
So the theme of the conference today is a call to action. When it comes to protecting our country, defending the nation, which is DoD's mission, protecting our enterprises, protecting people, as you said, in cyberspace, the status quo is clearly not enough. It's one of the reasons we're all here. It's one of the driving forces behind the new Cybersecurity Directorate. If you could wave a magic wand as we think about a call to action, what is one immediate thing that you would want to see done? What's one midterm thing? And as much as I don't like the term moonshot, because it's very specific, what would be one moonshot aspirational call to action that you would ask for?
So I'm afraid moonshot's probably hard because the diversity of the cybersecurity industry, but I would say this. First, cybersecurity is fundamentally a leadership question across the private and public sector. And reaching agreement to do the things that are difficult, that need to be done. What do I mean? When we look at, for example, Internet of Things, we know that represents significant risk, whether it's for data collection, whether it's for connection to control systems. Standards exist, but we haven't chosen as a community to actually implement them. So that would be certainly one thing, that leadership across the public and private sector. But I'll go to more specific. I can't resist the question here. So first I would say from an immediate perspective, one thing and then I'll add a 1B if I could. So one quick thing is, we see rampant abuse of internet infrastructure. The internet wasn't built for security, it was built for ease of communications. So in that case, implementing certain things which some have started that really make that abuse of internet infrastructure more difficult. DMARC, BGPsec for internet routing, DNSSEC for internet addressing, those elements that make that internet infrastructure more secure. And then second and related to that would be broad access to protected DNS. DNS is a key way that adversaries use for command and control, for exploitation, and making broadly available secure commercial DNS services exist. They're easy to use. A shout out to our British partners in the NCSC who've made such services available across government. Making those available, and we in government could help by adding or contributing our threat information to make those services even more effective. So that would be from an immediate perspective. I think certainly from a medium and then longer term, it would be identity. There is a hodgepodge of identity and authorization services available, but think about what we could do if we could interconnect them and they could communicate. Beyond internet transactions, when you go back to your question about root of trust, so much of influence operations, masquerading as Americans to conduct influence operations is because anonymity is available online, or false identities are available online. So if we could achieve that, it would have even broader impact beyond cybersecurity. So that would be the longer term approach would advocate for.
But no moonshot.
I'll keep thinking.
Okay. I want to sort of wrap the talk up with this. The Enduring Security Framework is something you were deeply involved with, and it's a really interesting model on how to operationalize public-private partnership and achieve real outcomes. Can you spend just a minute talking about ESF and what it is, what was achieved with ESF, and how that can serve as a model?
So public-private partnership is just foundational to what needs to happen in cybersecurity, and that was a really good example of an effective public-private partnership. So I'll quickly tell the story, which was NSA had sensitive threat information about an adversary's development of a set of exploits at firmware, so foundational to the first part of a computer that boots up.
Yep.
And through the Enduring Security Framework that had key companies, we shared the threat information and then worked together to build the technology standard for signed and updated BIOS. And then we linked that to using the power of procurement across government once that standard was issued, to where DoD began saying in 2012 they would only purchase clients and servers, PCs and servers that met that standard. And that drove the industry. The industry was ready because of the advanced work they had participated in to define the technical standard and begin implementing it. And the key piece was that to actually implement that required linkage across chip manufacturers, OEMs, and certainly the operating systems, since they were ready. So bottom line, from 2008, where 10% of PCs and servers had secure BIOS. That jumped to 2016 to where 80% of routine servers and client now had BIOS firmware that met that security standard that had really been defined by technical experts working across private and public sectors to quickly address a threat. So the computers we all use were more secure as a result. So I look at that as really a great example of bringing the best of the government's insights and technical expertise with private sector's technical expertise, willingness to partner quickly, and really roll out improvements to address a key threat.
And I wanted to bring this up because ESF is such a powerful example of public-private partnerships working together to drive a very particular outcome successfully, much like Russia Small Group is another example of that in a very different context. And to be successful, it just strikes me that that's how we need to operate. It can't be about silos, government here, private sector here, individuals here. It can't be about silos between government agencies. Everyone's got to work together to drive to an outcome. Are we there? How close are we? And how confident are you we're going to get there in a broader sense and not just with specific set of activities?
I've seen tremendous progress in government working together, everybody playing their unique role towards improved cybersecurity outcomes. The threat's significant, and adversaries become more and more sophisticated. It demands it of us. And certainly have seen other advances and a lot of work done between government and the private sector. So bottom line, what I would say is the solution is private and public sectors working together, figuring out what right looks like, and I think we know, as we've talked about together, what that is, and then committing to doing that rapidly together to achieve a world where we've prevented and eradicated cyber actors from the systems that we most rely on and that we most care about.
Fantastic. You actually finished on the dot as the countdown went to 0. So that's just how precise Anne always is. I want to thank you for coming out, for the leadership of the NSA and recognizing how much the threat landscape has changed and the need to organize to address that threat. Really appreciate you being here, and just a huge round of applause for everything you guys
Thank
are doing.
you. Thank you so much.